Radio and Progressive Radio Network, SoundCloud, Stitcher, iTunes, on YouTube, and a lot more. My guest for this show, a return guest after a long time, is John Dean. He is co-author of the new book, Authoritarian Nightmare, Trump and His Followers, with Bob Altemeyer. Dean served as White House counsel for President Richard Nixon from 1970 to 1973, and his Watergate testimony helped lead to Nixon's resignation. His past books include Worse Than Watergate and Conservatives Without Conscience. It's great to have you on this show. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Rob.
And the book comes out August 25th.
Yes.
So, you say, like it or not, authoritarianism is on the ballot this November, and to defeat it, we must understand it. And so tell us about this book, Authoritarian Nightmare, Trump and His Followers. Why did you write it, and what do you want it to accomplish?
Wrote the book because it was being conspicuously ignored, the fact that there is about a half century, and some very serious science that really looks at authoritarian personalities, both the leader type and in particular even more work on authoritarian followers. That science was very apparent to a few of us when Trump ran in 2016. I wrote a number of columns, Bob Altemeyer wrote a number of columns, a few other social scientists did. The media didn't seem to pick it up. And didn't understand what was going on. But there is a very clear type political personality that has come to fore. It's not a large group. It's maybe 30 to 40% of the population at any given time.
Pretty big.
But enough with our electoral college to put somebody in the White House. And that's exactly what happened. And we thought that somebody ought to explain what's going on with the Trump presidency. Lots of sensation out there, but it's not really being explained why it's happening or why Trump's followers are tolerating it. But that's what this book addresses. It really looks at why people are inclined to follow this man and to believe in him and give him the leash he's gotten to do pretty much anything he wants to.
More unleash. So that answered the first half of the question. The second, what do you want it to accomplish?
If we can educate voters, they will understand that there are a few of these people who can be persuaded to abandon their ways and think in terms of the implications of what's happening on democracy. Most of these people, however, are locked in, and they're not going to ever change. This is one of the reasons that Trump's approval rating never changes. The core group, they just are solid, and they will remain solid. There's only one way to defeat them, and that's to overwhelm them. There are more people who are not authoritarian admirers than there are those who like authoritarian leaders. And they have to stand up and decide that they want to protect their democracy. And this book graphically points that out.
So what is authoritarianism? And you say there are two kinds, and I've been talking about this for many years myself. I'm a big believer in the need to understand it. So you've got the authoritarian leader and the authoritarian follower. What is authoritarianism, and what are those two kinds? And then we'll talk later about the third kind.
Broadly speaking, authoritarianism is the relationship of followers to a leader. And stripped to its essentials, authoritarianism happens when followers submit too much to the authorities in their life. What is too much? Well, we certainly have some historical examples that are pretty ugly. When you tolerate lying, cheating, stealing, and what have you, that's probably too much as well. So that's what authoritarianism can accomplish. When you look at it in its political forms, you can see everything from highly dictatorial regimes to a sort of a soft authoritarianism where the so-called leader pretty much abandons all the democratic principles we've long subscribed to and runs the country as he or she, in a few instances, would have.
Okay, so now talk about the difference between an authoritarian leader and authoritarian follower.
What we rely on is science to define and describe these people. And there are personality tests that where these people are very conspicuous and very proud of their behavior and very not hiding their behavior. What we did is we took that science and it breaks down into, as I say, two types. There are so-called social dominators, who are people who have very dominating personalities. They demand submission to their authority, and they are rather amoral in their behavior. They just don't care, what the implications of what they may or may not do. Obviously the classic example is a Hitler or a Stalin, a Mussolini. Mao was. We have them in softer forms today with some of the people that unfortunately Donald Trump buddies up to and thinks are terrific guys. Kim Jong-un is a clearly a social dominating personality type. That's the one type. The other, the so-called authoritarian followers, are people who score highly on what's known as the right-wing authoritarian test or scale. And that tickles out certain traits these people have that are recurring, and they are really boiled down to, let me get the qualities here. They're mostly men. They are people who are submissive to authoritarians. They feel comfortable and safe when they submit. They are aggressive on behalf of the authority they believe in, and they're highly conventional. They also can have many other traits. And what we're relying on are decades of testing of these people. And then we took those tests and we actually ran a survey through the Monmouth Polling Institute on the American electorate. Never happened before. We took a representative sample, about just under 1,000 people to get the national sample. And they were administered these tests to find out where they would fall. And while we skewed the test a little bit towards Republicans because we are interested in studying Trump's base and how they responded to this, it's still fairly representative of the population in general. And we found significant numbers of right-wing authoritarian followers and social dominators, and typically what had been the general findings of science before this, but it had never been confirmed on a large scale like we were able to do.
So tell us a little bit about what those findings were.
The Monmouth poll was pretty startling. It was actually, for Altemeyer, a confirmation of a life of studying these people and having to do it with students and their parents and others. The 990 people in our poll, we were very clearly able to identify who Trump's base is as to their high approval of him. And when you get into the roughly 73% and above approval, you know you've got somebody who's a serious Trump fan. And there are two groups. There are two pillars to his core supporters. They're white males without a 4-year college degree. And the other large group are white evangelicals or born agains, in other words, the religious right. And that's much larger than the pillar of white males without higher education. They are the bulk of his followers, in fact, the evangelicals. And we took a deep dive and looked at them, and Bob Altemeyer has been actually studying the religious right for many, many decades. When I did the book Conservatives Without Conscience, that was a book I started to write because the late Senator Barry Goldwater, who had been a very prominent person in the conservative movement, was distressed about what was happening with the religious right coming in and sort of taking control of the conservative movement. And he said he held them in not very high esteem. He found them very difficult to deal with politically. They would not compromise, could not compromise in many instances because it was their religious belief. And they thought that they were acting on the word of God often. And this isn't very good for resolving political conflicts. So he said, I need to, I don't understand these people. Well, that's when I discovered Altemeyer and his partner's work, where they had looked at the religious right and found out who these people are. One of the first things they noticed in a lot of their study is that being a Christian doesn't necessarily mean being a highly moral individual, which surprised some.
Their chapter on evangelicals is fascinating. I have to tell you, I mean, I have been looking at this and trying to understand them for a long time, and you really bring some insights and new information to it that is just really valuable.
Yeah, it's unfortunately not new information. It's new information to most people. While this science has been going on for several decades now, it's really pretty much known only to academics. And that's one of the reasons I convinced Bob to do this book, is to get it out for the broader public, because you really can't understand what's going on today without understanding all this work of understanding these people. Anyway, the fact that their religiosity does not relate to their morality is well documented. And even more interesting to me was, at the bottom line, their religion could be discarded for their political expedient beliefs, sometimes in furtherance of those beliefs. And so they can tolerate somebody like Trump, who is really the antithesis of everything they preach as far as his behavior, but yet they can embrace him by pretty much just disregarding their religious fundamentals.
I'm fascinated. You described how they have this like self-righteousness, and that they can ask God for forgiveness for anything, and the easy forgiveness makes sin more likely to occur. And you cite Dietrich Bonhoeffer's term, cheap grace. And then you say that con men know the easiest people to fool are the people who fool themselves. And that you get into in the book is one of the big things that authoritarians do, is fool themselves. They're disconnected. You talk about, and we'll get into that, but you talk about how they compartmentalize their knowledge and their ways of thinking. That's fascinating, really.
It's not that Trump has studied these people or that his advisors have gone through this science to know who's out there. It's very intuitive with demagogues. They both are attracted to and attract certain personality types who follow them. And a demagogue without a follower is really pretty comic, and somebody just shouting on a soapbox. But when they get followers, and those followers are as committed as authoritarian followers are wont to be, you've got a serious problem. And that's what we're facing with Trump and his followers. So
go ahead.
I was going to say the combination of the white males with no college education and the evangelicals really are the base. And those are the people who are with him through thick and thin. Now, with some of these people, they don't realize how prejudiced they are. One of the most stunning results of our work, and it was confirmed in the Monmouth survey, is Trump has assembled probably the most prejudiced people in American politics. they're racist, they're homophobic, they're everything that many people don't think should be a part of democracy, but they are what they are, as Trump might say. It is what it is. And they are very deeply attracted to him, and they're not going anywhere.
Now, yeah, and you literally looked in your polling at prejudice as a factor in the relationship between that and Trump support and authoritarianism, right?
Trump has assembled probably the most prejudiced coalition that's in modern time, and that's the core thinking of his base as well. It is not only, it is the glue that holds his base together. They look at each other and realize it's okay because others like the fact that they're like thinking people. They find comfort at these rallies where they can hoot and howl and say very nasty things about people that are not white and Anglo-Saxon roots as they are. So it is the most troubling part of the coalition he's got. One of the things that is possible with a few of them, some of these people don't know how prejudiced they are. And if you ask them, they would say they're not prejudiced at all. And they don't want to be seen as being prejudiced. These are people who, hopefully with a book like this, might discover where they really are and say, I got to rethink this. This isn't what I want to be. But others that are the so-called social dominators, they're proud of their prejudice. They wear it as a badge of honor, and they're not going to go anywhere. They're going to remain prejudiced and be proud of their prejudice. I mean, somebody like his aide, Stephen Miller, is clearly proud of being a very prejudiced, racist individual. And Trump himself is trafficking on it. It's quite clear. He's discovered these people, and they've discovered him. And it's made for this ugly bond we have in American politics now.
Now, there are two other kind of cross currents that I think of when I think of the kind of person that you're describing as an authoritarian. One is the narcissist. And it seems to me, and I've done interviews about this and written about it, that certainly the authoritarian leaders are narcissists. I mean, I would think without fail. And then the other one is, and I got a lot of this from Stephen Hassan's book, The Cult of Trump. Are you familiar with it?
Yes.
Yeah. That there, I mean, it's really one of the ways that I can rationalize that intelligent people can support Trump is that they're cult members. I mean, so where does cult membership and narcissism fit in with this authoritarianism aspect?
I think when you dig one level below cult, you find personality traits that are common, and this is the glue that holds these people together in what are known as cults. And that's clearly what we have here. There is no question that these people are of common bond and common mind. So they're either one of the two. They are either a social dominator type and would score very highly on that, or they are a follower type. In other words, they want a strong leader to tell them how to think and what to do. They grow up with that kind of belief system. They are told all their lives that others will do their thinking for them, and they're happy to continue as adults in that manner. So we haven't mentioned it yet, but there's a third type that is known as the so-called double high. And these are people who test very highly for both traits. Very unusual, because somebody who tests high as a social dominator, you wouldn't think would test high as somebody who would be submissive to a dominator. But this happens because when they're taking the other tests in their personality and daily life, they're willing to submit to others to get power for themselves until they can take over. And they realize that everybody can't be the president. So why not be the president's chief of staff? Mark Meadows is a classic double high. He was rumbling around and bossing everybody around and dominating on Capitol Hill, but he obviously wasn't as high in the pecking order as the president of the United States. So stepping up his power and his affinity to it, he goes to the White House and becomes chief of staff, where I'm sure one of the weaknesses of Trump is that the last person in the room can generally persuade him to whatever position they hold. He is not deep. He's not knowledgeable. He is maybe the most incompetent person we've ever had in the White House, at the top of it, in the Oval Office. And so he's easily influenced by other strong authoritarian figures. But they know that he's in charge of the pecking order because the voters put him there. And he doesn't have a high tolerance for others who tend to suck up some of his light in his narcissistic need for attention. But you're right, the narcissistic personality is not unusual in the leader type. It isn't necessarily a key component in the science that we've looked at and have relied upon, but it's certainly there. And Trump is obviously a classic narcissist. Some say he is way beyond a healthy narcissist and has a malignant narcissism. So we'll see. We know that he's going to be on every night of the convention, the Republican convention, and there's only one reason to explain that: his narcissism. Most candidates for president stay off stage till the last night of the convention when they do their acceptance speech. Trump just can't be in a room where there's a live TV camera and not be on it. He can't even tolerate having a press secretary who might be getting more attention than he is. I mean, he's a sick puppy. Let's be real.
Well, you say that Trump brings out the worst in people. And I have this theory that the worst plague that Trump will bring to the U.S. is not COVID-19, which he's afflicted us with in a horrible way, but it's really the unleashing and unrestraining of these authoritarians, and I think of them a lot as narcissists. I think that his behavior has encouraged them, and you know, your book focuses mainly on the followers. I mean, would you agree that what he's done has made them worse than maybe ever before? Not just making the party so much about them, but exacerbating their influence on our culture.
What he's done is he's put social dominator type personalities in charge of agencies and departments, people who are not as big a fish as he is, but have the same instincts and what have you. Democracy does not do well with authoritarianism. We are not an authoritarian system. We're a bottom up where the public good is the norm. Authoritarians think about what's good for them and their cause and want to rule rather than govern. And there is a big difference. After I did the book in 2006, 2007, Conservatives Without Conscience, I did another book called Broken Government, where I looked at how these people operate in government, and they don't do well in democracy. They, as I say, they insist on ruling rather than governing, and so they don't want input from anyone that thinks very differently than they do, and they just want implementers and enablers rather than building consensus to make something work.
You include in one of your chapters a story about these global change game experiments with high and low authoritarian followers. And that's fascinating to show just how much more destructive in these experiments they were. It's just a great read. So
they were very able to destroy the world in the simulation on several occasions, and it's pretty frightening. They don't they don't do well in governing. A democracy doesn't work under these people. And that's the fear that Altemeyer and I have, and the reason we did this book, to show where we're going if we don't put these people out of power. And the interesting thing also is, even if Trump were to win, God forbid, they're not going anywhere. They're going to be around. And you can be sure that there are people today watching Trump's behavior and saying, my turn may be next. I can see what can be done now and who's out there. And I'm going to go out and try to capture that audience. And this will be somebody who is much smarter than Donald Trump. Trump did not, my first fear, initial fear of his presidency was his ignorance. He didn't have a clue how Washington worked. He doesn't even have a good newspaper knowledge of it. So I knew he was coming in as an incompetent.
I just want to add that you say that as a former White House counsel. You're an expert on that. You know about that.
I do know how the government works, and I know that it takes a couple years for people who are unfamiliar with the presidency to learn how it really works. They didn't, as when they came in, as they reported, they didn't even know where the light switch was in a cabinet room. So, and they hired nobody who really did. That was the other thing. But they've been there 3.5 years now, and they've begun to see how you can use this office for ill. The post office is a perfect example. The post office is theoretically a nonpartisan agency. It's been that way since 1970. During the Nixon administration, it was separated from the executive branch. The president does not appoint the postmaster. He's supposed to put in a nonpartisan and bipartisan board of directors. Well, he got Steve Mnuchin, his Treasury Secretary, to start saddling up to people who might be put on that board that they could control. And now we've got a real disaster in the post office. It's happened in every agency Trump has had any interest in dealing with. It started with the Environmental Protection Agency, where he has wrecked that. He has dismantled very fundamental controls on the environment. You know, if he's there 4 more years, there'll be virtually no sort of guiding national regulations. We're seeing it in the last 24 hours with his swaying the Federal Drug Administration, the FDA, to approve a very untested solution for coronavirus, something that has, in some instances, has caused more harm than good. This use of a very innovative treatment that has not really been shown to be any kind of miracle cure he's trying to peddle it off as. It's as bad as his pushing hydroxychloroquine or chloroquine earlier. So he's a wrecking ball for the long established norms and traditions of how government operates.
No, we need to take a break now. And when we come back, I want you to talk about, because you've mentioned demagogues, and in your book you talk about authoritarians and autocrats and demagogues and dictators. And I'd like you to kind of parse the differences between them. And then you hit my magic word, because the show is the bottom-up show. So you talked about how that's the opposite of what he is. So I'd like you to talk about how that fits in with it too. So we're going to take a brief break, and then we'll be back to continue. And my guest for this show is John Dean. He's the co-author of the new book, Authoritarian Nightmare, Trump and His Followers, with Bob Altemeyer. Dean served as White House counsel for President Richard Nixon from 1970 to 73, and his Watergate testimony helped lead to Nixon's resignation. His past books include Worse Than Watergate and Conservatives Without Conscience. So what are these differences? We've got authoritarians, autocrats, demagogues, and dictators. Can you parse them out and tell me about them?
Well, the quick analysis is that a demagogue is just another word for an authoritarian. It is a very conspicuous political figure that has been in the body politic since the times that Plato and Aristotle were writing about how democracy should and should not work. The demos part of demagogue came from their concept that democracy requires the people and the thoughts and the actions of the people. The demagogue is the person who doesn't want the crowd to do anything other than implement his or her, in rare instances, will. So demagogues are just a form of authoritarianism, and these concepts are broad. It is what I do not do in this book is delve into how other democracies have slipped from democracy into authoritarianism. It happens very slowly and very easily, typically with the public supporting it. And that's the frightening thing, that if there is a sufficient body of people to re-elect Donald Trump, he will take us into a soft authoritarianism that really pretty much demolishes our democracy.
And what you say is in the book is that very often authoritarians become demagogues because they're elected and then they erode the Constitution or the laws.
That is correct. It is our view is not a political science view of this problem. It is a psychologist and student of personality view. I worked for the last authoritarian president. We've had authoritarian presidents. Andrew Jackson was an authoritarian president under any definition of that term. Woodrow Wilson was an authoritarian president. Why were they authoritarians? Not only did they have dominating personalities, not only were they amoral, but they believed in inequality. That's another of the criteria that we use in who is and who is not an authoritarian. And the dispensing with equality in democracy is conspicuously a deep flaw. So Nixon was an authoritarian, and that's where my interest in this subject came from. I watched people around him, how they responded. I don't happen to be attracted to authoritarianism, and obviously that's one of the reasons it explains how I could easily break rank with my colleagues. But some of them were there to the bitter end, because it was just part and parcel of their personality to follow this man wherever he wanted to take them.
What about dictators? Where do they fit in related to autocrats?
Well, a dictator can be a demagogue, or he may or may not. He's an authoritarian. These are just other synonyms for who would come under authoritarian type rule. And it's a matter of degree. A dictator is more likely to have arrived in power through force and without the full consent of the people. Whereas today we're seeing dictators are not doing well. We see it in Belarus, where they say the last of Europe's dictators is about to go down. And what's happening, what's replaced by, is the authoritarian type leader who really has the consent of a sufficient number that he can govern. And it is it's a democratically sanctioned authoritarianism, where people give up their true democratic control of the government by ceding it to the leader of their choice.
Now, you say that there can be left and right-wing authoritarians, although most are right-wing, right?
Right.
So what does a left-wing authoritarian look like?
Well, it depends on where you are on the spectrum, but the the testing and the science we rely on, for example, the right-wing authoritarianism test and scales were actually done in Russia when the communists were still in power. While we would see that as far left, for the Russians who scored highly on those tests, they were actually doing well on the right-wing authoritarianism, because the definition of right and left that we are relying on is not the political right and left. A right-wing authoritarian this was drawn when Altemeyer came up with that name. He was thinking of the Old English term right, the W-R-I-T, the writ, if is otherwise pronounced, or in Old English right. And that is the established order, the correct way.
That's conservative.
Sort of, yes, yes. And that there are left wing, as far as from our political viewpoint. China would tend to be a left wing authoritarian regime.
What about Democrats? Are there authoritarian Democrats? Where would we find them?
When we did the Monmouth Poll, there were both Republicans and Democrats who tested. While they were overwhelmingly Republicans who scored highly as authoritarian personalities, there are a few Democrats that are in there, and they have their chosen authorities that they like, and it's just more prevalent with conservative thinkers than it is with more progressive thinkers. But it's a personality trait, so it's a disposition, if you will. And so it can happen, but it's not the norm.
So what would it look like? What would an authoritarian Democrat look like?
It would look no different than a Republican. It would just be somebody who would be a Trump supporter who happens to once called himself a Democrat and now calls himself a Trump supporter. So it wouldn't be any different. I mean, they're not zebras with different angled stripes.
So you wouldn't see Democrats voting for Democrats who are authoritarians, and because I think maybe some centrist moderate Democrats might pick somebody who is more likely to tell them what they want to hear. I don't know. I'm just trying to look at it, because I think there are Democrats who are going to be in the same way. Maybe not for Trump, but
they're not rigid demarcation lines on this. Pigeonholing people is very difficult, and you can actually find people on different issues taking different stances, and some would be very authoritarian on some stances and not on others. Some social scientists steer very clear of party politics in their analysis of authoritarianism. Our testing just shows they're predominantly Republicans.
Yeah. I'm looking. You had a graph. Here's the graph for the video. How do I get this to show here? The higher. Oh, there you go. The higher the score, the further right they are. And on the one side, you've got the really low scores of the Democrats, then the left-leaning independents, the right-leaning independents, and it's amazing how close it is that way.
Yeah, the Monmouth Poll was pretty startling, and Monmouth University is actually going to put out some blog posts on their work on this. Patrick Murray, who heads the Monmouth Polling Institute, was fascinated by the results that came in, and has actually done some follow-up questioning on it using slightly modified questions to sort of tighten up and see if he got the same correlations and reactions, and he did. And it pretty much convinced him that this is a remarkable explanation of who Trump's core is out there, who his base is.
And one of the things that it really tied it to was prejudice. That was fascinating, that you can explain most prejudice by authoritarianism.
Yes, direct relationship.
Why?
Well, it's both nature and nurture. These people often grow up to become the personalities they are, and it's because of the parental influence, the friends that they find in their circle, and it is their propensities that God has given them at birth, and their inclinations as to how to follow those. We don't science is unable to sort out exactly why we have the personalities we do, but students of personality tend to think it is predominantly the early influences in childhood. If you in doing this book, we had no idea that Mary Trump was going to provide the wonderful profile of her uncle that she did. But in the first chapters of this book, as you know, we look at Trump's, the sources of his authoritarianism, and discovered in the public record much of the material that Mary Trump would confirm in her own work. We actually give her, if you will, some confirmation, because we found some sources that she apparently was not aware of, but they just build on what she had, the dark influence that Donald Trump's father had on him, Fred Trump Sr., and his style of doing business and behavior, and how it warped and shaped this man to be who he is today.
Tell us a story. You've got 2 chapters in there about early Trump and his youth, and then before he was the most recent years. Tell us an anecdote, a story about him that'll give us an idea of who he is and how he became that way.
Well, to me, there were countless stories we went through in looking at his record, and to me, some of the most telling were his management style. While most people who work in organizations are familiar with dominating authoritarian personalities, they typically find they have some redeeming qualities. Donald Trump, in every management job he's been in as an adult, has managed to offend almost everybody in the organization for whom he is the leader. And he is somebody who has never accepted responsibility for any of his mistakes. You look at his business failings, which are many, and he accepts no responsibility for them. He will pass the blame off on people unable to defend themselves from those who've been killed in horrific accidents, to those who are still around, but he knows he's got them under confidentiality agreements, non-disclosure agreements, so they can't talk. He is no different as president than he was in running any of the organizations he did. The most successful one, we go into this a little bit, not in the depth of the research to get there, was his last one, The Apprentice. He was pretty down and out when Mark Burnett discovered him. He had just been through 6 bankruptcies. He was a failed businessman. When Mark Burnett went in, some of the team that put together The Apprentice, when they decided to use his offices, said the furniture was all chipped and falling apart. The place needed painting. It was pretty dismal. So they took this failing businessman and portrayed him as the mega mogul of New York, and created this really false image of him. that he would later run for president on as the most successful man in America. Most doubt he has ever had $1 billion. What he does have, he inherited from his father, who bailed him out time and time and time again. Excuse me. Often Donald was able to carry out the things his father only dreamed he could and wished he had. So he was willing to endlessly fund this. And it was a tax scheme that avoided all federal inheritance and other income taxes for decades and decades. I'm sure his family was horrified when he decided he was going to run for president, because they knew it was going to expose, potentially, and did expose, this generational tax fraud that had gone on for years to transfer about $500 million to Donald over the years. And he pretty much blew it all off in terrible business decisions. So
but I want one thing I want to get from you, though. And we need to do another ID. So let's do the show ID, another one, and we'll continue after that. Okay. Just a brief pause. And my guest for the show is John Dean. He's the co-author of the new book, Authoritarian Nightmare, Trump and His Followers, with Bob Altemeyer. John Dean served as White House counsel for President Richard Nixon from 1972 to 73. His Watergate testimony helped lead to Nixon's resignation, and his past books include Worse Than Watergate and Conservatives Without Conscience. Now, the thing I ask you, though, is I want a story. You've described his history, but I want an anecdote. I want an actual story that can give a picture of who he is. Can you do that?
Sure. Maybe one of the more telling stories is as Donald's father aged and showed signs of dementia. Donald was determined to try to change his father's will, and on countless occasions did that. It failed because the old guy was aware enough, and his lawyers were certainly sharp enough to see what Donald was doing. But Donald failed in that, but to show his mentality is he was trying to cut out his brother Fred from any inheritance, and his family. That's Mary Trump's father. And when the will was finally read, and it was just at the time that his nephew, or his great nephew, was being born and had multiple birth problems that would require care indefinitely, and very expensive. They'd all been on the Trump Organization health plan. Well, when the family that had been cut out of the will threatened to sue Donald and the others for their rightful inheritance, he cut off that child from any medical care, not caring if he didn't survive. It's one of the cruelest kind of family acts I think you could ever see. They worked it out. He forced them to settle, but it certainly is the reason today that you see this dysfunction playing out during this presidency. We most recently have seen it with Marianne Trump, his sister, who was interviewed by Mary Trump, telling her niece that Donald is untruthful, he's unprincipled, and he's cruel, amongst other things.
Well, wait. I just want now that you told the story, let me just unpack it a little bit. First, Trump's father developed dementia.
Yes.
You know how old he was?
He was in his 70s.
So around the same age as Trump.
Yes.
Okay. And Trump actually succeeded in doing something with the will because or did he attempt to use his ability to just litigate to get the changes?
He had partial success in getting the will changed, where it was not on unsympathetic ears with his father to cut out his brother Fred. Fred Sr., Trump's father, was always distressed that his namesake had not wanted to be part of the real estate business, and therefore the cutting him out of the will was no big deal for the father. But what Trump had tried to do was cut everybody out of the will and put himself in control, and the father spotted that and prevented that.
And what about the familial role? You talked about in the nurture part of authoritarians. Was Trump's father an authoritarian, and what's the connection there?
His father was absolutely an authoritarian personality, and tried to instill that in his children, in the boys. With Fred, it did not. Trump's older brother, it did not take. With Donald, he found a very receptive, young and later older man who the family thinks, both Marianne and sister Marianne and niece Mary, think is even worse than Fred Sr. And never dreamed that the man would become president of the United States, and are frightened by the fact he's there.
Is there a process or a pattern of transferring authoritarianism from parent to child?
It is both genetic and atmospheric. If you bring up a child in an authoritarian atmosphere and realize that they realize that's how they can get the love and attention of the father they crave, that's how it seems to have its roots.
You know, there's one of the thinkers on the left, George Lakoff, who wrote the book "Don't Think of an Elephant," who writes about cognitive framing and what have you. He's
Right.
written extensively about that, about how conservatives tend to be strict parents and liberals tend to be nurturing parents. So that fits in perfectly with what you just described.
Yeah, we made no effort in this book to get to the roots of authoritarianism. We go over it broadly. What we're trying to make people very aware of is the fact that Trump's followers are authoritarians, and no one should think otherwise, and should understand that authoritarian followers are the people who will tolerate his norm-busting, democracy diminishing behavior. And we're not built for this kind of treatment. Democracy is fragile. And he is, through his lack of understanding, his incompetence, but enabled by people who know better, really destroying our democracy.
Yeah, he's a real threat. Now, we've got about 7 minutes left, and I want to cover, in the middle of the book, you talk about the right-wing authoritarianism scale, which you've already mentioned, RWA, and that there are 7 traits of authoritarians. Can you talk about them?
Well, let me go back to first of all, the key traits. Hang on just a second here. Blow those up for myself. The defining traits are the fact that it is somebody who is submissive to authority, and that personality then must be aggressive on behalf of the authority to which they're submissive. The other defining trait is they're very conventional. In other words, they like the norms and conventional standards, the the middle class normal way of doing things. In testing them, however, they often are highly religious. They have very moderate to little education. They're untrustworthy of other authorities, and they're highly prejudiced. When I say prejudiced, I mean particularly against homosexuals, women, and followers of other religions than their own. They also have repeatedly shown themselves mean-spirited. They're narrow-minded. They're intolerant. They're bullies. They're dogmatic. They're uncritical towards their chosen authority. They're highly hypocritical. In other words, they can strikingly believe in multiple conflicting situations. They're inconsistent and contradictory. They're prone to panic easily. They're highly self-righteous. They're moralistic. They're strict disciplinarians. They're severely punitive. They demand loyalty and they return it. They have very little self-awareness, and most tests have them as economic or Republican conservatives. So that's sort of the broad profile of who these people are. And this isn't something that others say about them. It's what they say about themselves. They repeatedly in testing, Rob, show these traits. And they're fairly defining. And this is, I say, a large portion of Trump's base. They are typically these people are those who fall within the religious right, either the evangelicals or the born-agains. And not all of them are happy being where they are. And those are the few that might be reached with a book like this.
You know, the one element that's kind of stuck out for me that I hadn't thought about is high level of aggression in the name of their authorities. Talk about that.
Well, they will, the Trump campaign is a wonderful example. These people, you have seen them in the last few years. They show up at the rallies. When Trump says, these people, the fake media are enemies, well, the crowd will turn around and boo the established press. When he says that, when he says something, mentioned Hillary Clinton's name, next thing you've got a chant, lock her up going. That's an aggression that is really very unusual in American politics at that level. So those are examples of the aggression in behalf of that authority, their authority being Donald Trump.
Then we've got to wrap in a couple minutes. You finished the book with an extensive chapter on Trump's re-election playbook and what Trump's second term would look like. What would Trump's second term look like?
In other words, give you a chapter in a soundbite, which is tough. It would be, I think we have one sentence in there. It's like giving the keys of a tank to an angry 2-year-old would be what it would be like. And so you can just begin to imagine from there. It would not be pleasant. I frankly do not believe democracy can survive a second Trump term, whether it be out of ignorance or his now discovering what he can't do. There'll just be the rule of law has no meaning. If, for example, he controls the Senate still, Republicans control the Senate, there'll be no check on him at all. That's looking increasingly difficult, even if he does win. He's not going to win the House of Representatives. That he is going to lose control of. But he could reverse the slide of the Senate. That's proven the weakest link in our democracy, where you have a divided Congress and they're unwilling to exercise their basic controls and put any checks on this man. And that's been, I think if somebody had checked him early, he might have been a better president. He might have actually gotten down to business. It's also quite stunning, Rob, that he has no programs. He's not recommending anything for a second term. He's just throws out ideas he may or may not do. He'll probably come up with some plans this week to pretend like he has something, but he has been repeatedly asked, most conspicuously by Sean Hannity, what he was going to do with his second term. It was a softball question not long ago, and he had no answer. He started explaining experience and how experience was important, but had not a single iota of an agenda for a second term.
When we got to wrap, I just need to throw in one more piece of information that you include in your book, and that is you did a look, or somebody did a look at the news sources that people tended to trust the most to make them the most biased. And 4 out of 5 were conservative ones, and the one on the left was MSNBC. People who trusted that the most and were most rigid in their thinking. And among the conservative ones, it was OAN, Fox, Breitbart, and the worst one of all was Rush Limbaugh. So the people who paid attention to Rush Limbaugh were the ones who were the most unwilling to think about things or change their minds.
Well, and as you saw also in the Monmouth Poll, Fox News scored very high with Trump's followers.
Yeah.
That is the official Trump network,
yeah.
And it is Trump TV.
So we've got to wrap. This has been a great interview. The book, Authoritarian Nightmare, Trump and His Followers. John Dean is the author, and it's a great book. We've barely touched the surface of what's in there. You've got so much useful information and analysis. We didn't even talk at all about how authoritarianism affects COVID-19 response, which is a great beginning chapter of the book. Thanks so much for being on the show.
Thanks, Rob. Be well.